Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about another book that I've read in the last year. And this book is Evenings in Paradise by Lucia Berlin. It is a short story collection and there appeared in 2015 another thicker collection by Lucia Berlin. Both of these little volumes are posthumous volumes. Berlin died a while ago. She hasn't been very well recognized during her life, and publishers are now, I think, trying to do justice to her legacy. If we would want to place her in terms of style and literary movement, she could be counted among one of the maybe minor masters of second half 20th century American short prose, so short story mainly. She published relatively successfully during her life, and she also received a literary prize, but most of her stories appeared in magazines, and she always worked besides her writing. She didn't earn enough by her writing to sustain herself and her children. And she has worked a number of interesting jobs. She's been a nurse, she has been a teacher, she's been a university lecturer, and she has lived in Chile and all across the US. She had a very adventurous life. Now, what to say about this little book? So, one of the interesting things about this book is its style. Berlin writes in very crisp, short, to-the-point sentences, and she usually writes in very natural language. It is as if you would be having a chat with someone, as if someone would be telling you some stories, some interesting things about their lives, or some significant events in their lives, periods of their lives. And many of these stories they either revolve around a specific event, say a Christmas party, a funeral, or a short series of events. Say in one story, a couple of things that happen during the weeks after a friend passes away. So, if you hear this, one might ask, well, why should I read such a book? Why should I listen to someone tell me stories? Well, maybe one of the reasons why it's nice to read this kind of books during the C-19 pandemic is that we just don't really have these kind of random encounters, right? We meet our family, maybe a couple of close friends or colleagues from time to time. But those situations where we just end up talking with someone who's either a good storyteller or a good listener, and we just genuinely share some experiences, ideas, in a very spontaneous and relaxed way, these don't really occur. It's just simply impossible. We don't meet anyone, we don't go out as much, and even when we do, we are wearing masks and keeping our distance, right? Social distance. Anyway, let's not go into the politics of that now. But basically, reading Berlin is very relaxing. It engages one's imagination. It is really as if one would be listening to a witty friend or an interesting acquaintance who has a lot of life experience and has gone through a good deal in their lives and tells us about these things. Accordingly, most of the short stories are autobiographical, or at least inspired by the events of Berlin's life. But that's not really a problem. Berlin has had quite the life, and there is plenty of content you can draw on. And one of the interesting things is that in most of these stories, there is an interesting tension between detail and lack of specificity. There's an enormous amount of detail coming it's almost a barrage of detail. Like somebody's telling us the stories and what is important, vitally important to understand the story, and what is more like an illusion, a point, a little added detail that helps us to get into the mood of the story or helps us to imagine the story in its full detail, but there isn't really a clear division between these elements. Let me read out a short passage which might help to understand what I mean here. So this passage is from the story Daughters. It reads, "The daughter Irena sits on the only chair in the dining room, an ugly plastic chair, all wrong. I want to throw it out. Go rent her another one, buy one, quick. Her profile with a long neck is curved like an albino dinosaur, a marble cobra, an anorexic whippet. See, I'm sick. I make her sound grotesque. She's the most lovely creature I have ever seen. Pale green eyes, hair like white honey, like the inside of a pear. She's 14, in white, wearing the now fashionable lace gloves with no fingers. Her bony hands lie in her lap, like the little white birds you eat whole in Guadalajara. Too much cinnamon. She wears white lace stockings with no feet, pulsating blue traceries on her ankles. Her mother touches her pale hair. Irena flinches, does not acknowledge her mother at all. When her father does the same thing, she doesn't speak to him, but she bares her exquisite white teeth." So what you see here is that we get really so much detail. It's easy to imagine this young lady at 14. She clearly makes a great impression, a powerful impression on the narrator, the fictional person telling us this story, sharing their experiences with us. And there's a good deal of this in Berlin's stories. And the interesting thing about this is that the more and more stories we get, the more and more these informations sort of add up to a voice through the stories. We never really meet Berlin, the writer of the stories. We always meet fictitious, semi-fictitious narrators, made-up storytellers who are different from the writer. These are the persona who tell their stories, and we're listening to them, engaging in a conversation with them. Nevertheless, and it is never said out who the narrator is, what kind of person they are, what kind of intentions they have with telling us these stories. But by listening to them, we sort of get to know the speaker, we become familiar, and the whole book becomes very homely and pleasing. After a couple of stories, I didn't want, in general with short stories, I don't like to read more than one or two by the same author every day, because I feel that there's a threat that I forget about the less significant ones very easily, then their memories sort of extinguish each other. But in this case, I was really excited often to pick up the book again and continue reading Berlin, because it was the excitement I sometimes feel with one of my childhood friends, Balint, who is an excellent storyteller, and he makes a lot of overstatements but presents even the most mundane things that happen during his day in such a funny way that one can't help feel entertained and laugh. And it was a bit like that with Berlin. Now, mind you, Berlin isn't very funny, but I think the interestingness, the uniqueness of the voice in the end adds up to a very nice, memorable experience. And what else could I say about this book? Well, maybe one of the interesting things is that the less Berlin gives us pre-crafted insights, there are no, big judgments or big truth about life. There are metaphors, and there are plenty of them, but they're usually more, they look like aids which the narrators use to get to terms with the events in their lives. They sound a lot more like that and not like some pre-packaged or distilled wisdom which we should take home and apply to our own lives. They're very much particular, and they're very much in the context of the settings of the stories. Now, most of these stories are set in the US between, say, the roughly 1960, early 1960s up to the 1980s. There are plenty of nice little details which set the mood and the age well. A very interesting thing which I noticed was that Berlin recreates the mood of certain years. She uses, for example, song titles. There is one from a story about her affair with a jazz musician, and let me very quickly read this to you, and you will see what I mean by that. Just a moment, I'll find it eventually. I did make quite a few notes. Usually when I read literature, I don't put so many little stickers into the book, but this one was precious to me. So this is a bit I wanted to read out from A Foggy Day. It was a good year, though. Pinion smoke, laughter. The three of them listened and listened. Miles, Coltrane, Monk. They also listened to scratchy tapes of Charles Olson, Robert Duncan, Lenny Bruce. Paul was a poet. It seemed he didn't sleep at all. He wrote somewhere all morning. Benjamin slept late, practiced, played most of the afternoon, and listened to music, earphones on, with the seriousness of a student in a language lab. Benjamin was a large, quiet man, a kind man with a firm sense of right and wrong. He was fatherly and patient to Lisa, except when she exaggerated, often, which he said was tantamount to lying. He never spoke in the past or future tense. Every night she was surprised when he made love to her. He was tender, playful, and passionate, kissing her everywhere, her eyes, her breasts, her toes. She loved his strong hands on her breast and how he would make her come with his tongue. She loved the nakedness in his hazel eyes as he entered her. Each night she thought that it would be different in the morning between them after what had happened, as she had felt the first time she ever had sex. She wouldn't look the same the next day. After they made love, he would put Vaseline and white gloves on his hands and then put on a Lone Ranger sleep shade and earplugs. Lisa would sit up in bed smoking, remembering silly things that happened that day and wishing she could wake him. During the day, she spent most of her time with Paul, reading, talking, arguing at the kitchen table. Later she imagined that it rained that whole time, because for months she and Paul read Darwin and V.H. Hudson and Thomas Hardy by a pinion fire that also existed only in her mind. Now the funny thing you see is this is about one page, and we get from the pinion smoke back to the fire next to where they sit. And in this one page, she summarizes a whole year. This is a year when she lives with her partner, the musician Benjamin, she has sex with, and with their friend Paul, the poet. And just with a couple of words she throws in there about the music they listen to. Benjamin is a musician, and he's interested in the latest trends. We can pretty easily identify this period, right? Thelonious Monk is popular, Coltrane is popular, coming up, exciting, people are listening to it and discovering new things through it. So this is a tool which Berlin uses very aptly. Interestingly, she doesn't do the same for places. Many of the places in the book are very underdescribed, and I found this also to be similar to how many people actually experience their surroundings. A lot of people don't think about their the city where they live, the place where they live, as something very particular. They maybe don't know the population number, the GDP of their town or area or state. They're not necessarily very familiar with the exact geography of their region, and so on, the industrial strengths, whatnot. They feel in a certain way about the place and the place that they have spent in that the time that they have spent in that place. And that is the kind of atmosphere that Berlin's short stories also recreate, rather than giving us very specific impressions of particular places. Now, one of the other things I liked about Berlin, and I think is a virtue of her writing, is how she uses this specificity to build relatable characters and to help us to imagine her characters. And the visualizations speak to us in interesting ways. They are connected to character traits in some ways. So listen to this short passage from the short story Sombra. The bullfight group assembled in the lobby at 2:30. There were two American couples, the Jordans and the McIntyres. The men were surgeons at a convention in Mexico City. They were tennis fit and tanned. Their wives were expensively dressed, but in that time warp doctors' wives have, wearing pantsuits fashionable back when they put their husbands through medical school. The women wore cheap black felt Spanish hats with a red rose that were sold on the streets as souvenirs. They thought they were fun hats, not realizing how coquettish and pretty they looked in them. So you see, this was just a short passage, but we get a really good sense about these two couples, and they remain a little bit indistinct, but nevertheless we do remember that these are two couples. There are some similarities and parallels due to their lifestyles and their ways of thinking, and we learn a little bit about that. It's just very nice how we get a mixture of vagueness and detail. We have some spots that we can fill in with our own imagination, with our own creativity, exercising our own artistic ability to come up with some details, colors for the clothes of the people and so on, their facial features, their height. However, we do get enough information to sort of pin them down both in the story and in general in the setting which Berlin describes. And you can see in both of these, both the previous passages I have read out and this passage, that Berlin seems to always have a purpose. She wants to tell us something. We feel this genuine intention to communicate and to engage us. At the same time, there is no very obvious and very clear message. A lot of books that are famous and a lot of books that are popular these days try to suggest quite easily guessable, quite easily understandable messages. And that seems to be more or less often missing in Berlin. When some of the characters do make statements which sound like conclusions about life or happiness, we often get the feeling that, oh yeah, I know a person who thinks that way. We don't feel like, oh, I gained an insight. This person who has reflected on this question in general, in a philosophical way, in a universal way, has told me, given me a new perspective of how to look at my own life. Then we rather feel, oh yeah, one of my friends is that type of person who thinks in that way about their life. And there's of course nothing wrong with that. We don't have to be educated. We don't need to continually sort of improve ourselves and reflect on ourselves and be terribly aware. In this age, TED Talks, a lot of government and corporate propaganda about self-betterment, fighting for jobs, fighting for the opportunity to prove yourselves, upskilling, lifelong learning, and so on. We often feel this pressure that, we have to get better, we have to constantly take something away. Listening to Berlin is really not like that. It's really just like, yeah, I've heard a particular story of a concrete person who had their life, and I don't make the same choices. I won't go through these situations, but nevertheless it was very interesting. Maybe it was even more interesting, right? This is not someone in generic telling you a feel-good story at the end of which you can feel like, yes, resilience is important. And sorry, I'm not poking fun at it. Resilience is important. It's just that it's sometimes just good that someone isn't teaching you or preaching to you. Or at least that's how I felt. And maybe the book will make you feel in a different way. In either case, I can definitely recommend this. It's a nice little reading experience, and I'm not sure you will feel that there was a reason to read this book in the sense that you understand literary history much better or society much better. You might, if you put it in the appropriate context. But even if you don't have this kind of big insight through reading it, I think it can be just very entertaining, which is one of the hallmarks of nice literature. Relaxes you and it entertains you. And with that, I recommend this book to all of you, and thank you for listening. Have a lovely day. Take care.